I'm glad to welcome you to the King Institute for Faith and Culture, our second program for this fall. I'm going to leave it to Dr. Story to introduce our speaker for this morning. We're happy she's here. I just have a couple of quick housekeeping details. Following this talk, if you want to have a chance to speak with Jessie, feel free to come up front, or we're also going to go to the Tadlock House where we'll have coffee. Feel free to join us there. We're also going to go to lunch, probably around 11:30 in the Tipton room, and would be delighted if you want to join us for lunch in there. That's the back room in the cafeteria. I had 3 other programs lined up for the next 6 weeks, all 3 of which have moved owing to chemotherapy, knee surgery, and travel difficulties from a foreign country. So I'm scrambling. I'll tell you when the next event is, and I'm not exactly sure when. We do have 2 coming up in November, but September and October are a mystery waiting for me to solve it. So we'll find out when the next program is here. We also have a second opportunity to hear Jessie tonight, which also bears CCS credit at Emmanuel Episcopal Church. That's on the Virginia side downtown. So please join us for any of those events, coffee, lunch, and tonight. And I'm going to ask Dr. Story to introduce our speaker.
I almost got some applause, I think. Thanks. Good morning, everyone. In my Appalachian literature class right now, we're reading James Agee. Agee was born in Knoxville and then went on to a couple of the best schools in the country, Phillips Exeter, where Frederick Buechner would later be chaplain, and then Harvard. Either in spite of or because of his excellent education, Agee remained someone from Appalachia. His articles for Fortune magazine on the creation of the TVA and the effect of that on the people in the Tennessee Valley show his ability to see the mountains in the context of a bigger story. This is one of my favorite quotes from those articles. He says, TVA knows that it is, among other things, a passel of smart Yankees descended to improve a tetchy people. Isn't that great? But Agee's most enduring work is a novel about his father's death that takes place almost entirely in very still, quiet moments. And these moments almost all take place in the mind and the memory of the Follett family. And that's what we're reading in our class. Part of our calling here as faculty is to invite students to a life of the mind, as we say sometimes. And I've been thinking about what that means when I've been reading James Agee and reading Jessie Van Eerden. Like regular life, the life of the mind involves days and weeks of repetitive work and habit, and then from time to time, the unexpected glory of the great hike with your family, or the party with your best friends, or the slow dance with the person you've most wanted to slow dance with. And the life of the mind mirrors real life in that the richest life of the mind involves other people. The life of the mind requires relationships with other minds. And so we read, and we listen to music, and we look at art. Reading Jessie and James Agee, I've been marveling at their ability to create this vast interior life for the characters. And I've been thinking of how Jessie's writing models those relationships of the life of the mind. In her essays, she walks us almost always pretty deep into the woods of faith or of hope or of desire by way of online dating. But like the best writers, she takes us by the hand, guides us through what E.E. Cummings called the enormous room, the mind. In Jessie's writing, we'll meet old friends like Walker Percy or Simone Weil, and we'll make new ones like Crystal Lemley or the lady at the Dollar General. And that brings us right back here to Appalachia and this very chapel on this campus, described by R.T.L. Liston as a place of the mind. Last night, my son and I listened to this show called Inside Appalachia on public radio, and they spent an hour asking, what is Appalachia? If they had asked Dr. Liston or James Agee, or if they had been reading Jessie Van Eerden, they might have said, Appalachia is a place of the mind. Jessie comes to us from West Virginia. She has an MFA from the University of Iowa and is associate professor of creative writing at Hollins University up the road in Roanoke. She's the author of 3 novels, most recently the award-winning Call It Horses, and a book of portrait essays called The Long Weeping. I'm very excited to have her here today. Please welcome Jessie van Eerden.
Good morning. How's that sound? Okay in the back? Okay. Thank you, Dr. Story, for such a great introduction. I've known Brandon for a few years, so it's fun to come back here, and I visited King a while ago. So grateful to him, to Dr. Shaw, to Dr. Dodderwyk for inviting me here, and James Agee is one of my favorite writers, so it's really fun to be kind of put in his company. Death in the Family is an amazing book. So there's a little handout that I've given because I'm a teacher at my heart, so I always have to have some sort of visual aid, and I can't really abide PowerPoint, I think, after the age of COVID or during the age of COVID, so I wanted to be kind of low-tech today. But Dr. Dodderwyk, asked me to speak about the writer's vocation or the calling to write and the vocation of the creative writer. And I'm often very squirrely about subjects of capital I importance. I think I agree with Mary Gordon, who says, I don't know what the nature of the universe is, but I have a good ear. So I usually hide behind music of language, and so it's good for me to be pushed to try to say something about what I think about the calling of what I feel is my purpose in this world, to move words around on paper. So when I think of this topic of writing as a vocation, some ideas do come to mind that I think are valuable to me, and I have kind of 3 main points I'm going to try to make today. I think of writing more as a way of being in the world, less than as a career path or an identity. Seeking a vocation seems to me foremost to be about preparing and building a self who can walk many paths. It seems less about making a vocational choice and more about becoming a person who can choose wisely, and less about avoiding failure and more about becoming a resilient person with inner resources who can fail and fail better, as Samuel Beckett said, and keep on. In fact, I find it more compelling to frame discussions of vocation with my own students around preparation for failure rather than preparation for success. Not because I don't believe in my students, but because I know from experience that failure is usually where the real growth happens. All with a focus on tilling the soil of the inner life. So even when I think about the work of writing, I think less about book contracts, I think less about publishing, and more about something the poet Stanley Kunitz once wrote, and this is on your sheet. I've tried to give you various resources if you're interested in some of these writers' thoughts that you can take with you and explore. And he said the first important act of the imagination is to create the person who writes the poems. So with all this in mind, 3 central aspects stand out most to me when I consider the writer's vocation and when I think of what that calling could mean. The calling to become a person who writes and really cannot imagine a life in which she does not write, who sees her writing as a way of being in the world. And you could think of these aspects as callings in themselves, kind of mini callings or sub-callings within this vocational frame. The first is a calling to attention. The second is a calling to acknowledgement of tributaries. And the third is a calling to what I call contemplative longing. So I'm going to start with the vocation or calling to attention and what that means to me. Writing for me is a spiritual practice, and paying attention is part of that practice, or a discipline, a habit, as Dr. Story was saying, a habit of the mind, a habit to cultivate. Write what you know you'll hear sometimes, and there's some truth in that advice. We get the richest texture in our work when we write things and places and people with which we're intimate. But it's also true that we write what we don't know, or rather, we write because we don't know. We write toward our deepest questions, which keeps us in a posture of vulnerability and continually creates and renews the imagination. Attention requires not knowing. It's a self-emptying gesture. Though the artist's ego is often talked about, art making requires humility and letting go of self-importance, letting go of certainty and listening deeply to one's subject. The artist is not a creator as much as a receiver, or as the artist John Berger puts it, the artist gives form to what is received. Another writer who speaks to this is Flannery O'Connor, who's kind of close to us, from Georgia, a Southern writer, and this one's on your sheet. She wrote in Mystery and Manners, which, if you're interested in the writer's vocation, is probably one of my favorite texts, a collection of her lectures, and it speaks a lot about her Catholic faith as an inspiration for her work, too. She writes that no art is sunk in the self, but rather in art, the self becomes self-forgetful in order to meet the demands of the thing seen and the thing being made. The demands of the thing being made require us to put assumptions and ego aside for the sake of rendering something truthfully. And I have an example of this from the writer, I don't know if you know Yoon Lee. We overlapped in grad school just a little bit. She's a wonderful fiction writer of Chinese descent, and she visited our school up in Hollins last year. And she had this wonderful illustration about truthfulness that comes from attention. She said, what I pay attention to is likely more important than what I imagine, which is kind of weird for a fiction writer to say, I think, in some ways. But I found the comment so provocative, and her example was very accurate. It came from writing about grief and thinking about grief in the abstract and sort of through our lens of assumption. We might imagine someone pounding on a table very dramatically, full of grief, full of mourning, and performing grief in a way we've seen it before, maybe cinematically. But she recently observed driving with a widow in a car who just lost her husband. The woman sat there quietly thinking her husband was somehow the blinker on the car in front of them. Totally irrational, but just this really quiet manifestation of her grief and longing. It's not huge, it wasn't performative. And that was her form of grieving. And those are the moments that we notice as writers that have a kind of truth to them and kind of self-recognition that the bigger, grander gestures sometimes lack. So we have to watch our characters intimately and attentively in all of their intricacy and respect them and not impose prepackaged emotions and ideas on them. And then we might say something true about human experience. A writer needs to continually cultivate perceptivity in looking at the least of things, even an inanimate object. You may have heard of the poet John Keats very famously talking about the concept of negative capability. He says, a poet is the most unpoetical of anything in existence because he has no identity. He's continually in, for, and filling some other body. The poet should conceive of a billiard ball that it may have a sense of delight from its own roundness, smoothness, and very volubility and rapidity of its motion. So writing grounds us in the senses where we are humblest and where we are dust. That is our source of attention. It grounds us especially in looking, and looking grounds our writing in the truth. Coming back to Flannery O'Connor again, I've put one of my favorite quotes from Mystery and Manners on your sheet that I use with my students all the time. She's writing about Flaubert's Madame Bovary here in his novel. And she says, it takes at least 3 activated, sensuous strokes to make an object real. So mentioning at least 3 of the senses. We have 5. Just to remind you, it's early. This is connected with our having 5 senses, she says. If you're deprived of any of them, you're in a bad way. But if you're deprived of more than two at once, you almost aren't present. It's always necessary to remember that the fiction writer is much less immediately concerned with grand ideas and bristling emotions than he is with putting list slippers on clerks. And that phrase comes from a moment in Madame Bovary where he has put list slippers on clerks. But her point is that a lot of times I think people come to fiction writing with huge agendas. And I think she's trying to get us away from that. There's something, as Dr. Story said, there's something about the smaller moments in which fiction is made. A writer's attention's intimately connected, too, with how she sees and treats others. So I love the idea that, and maybe this is self-indulgent, but I want to write, so I want to think about what kind of person it makes me, too, not just that I want to get lost in fantastical worlds, but what does my writing do for my human vocation, for who I am in a world connected with other people? And Richard Rohr says in his contemplative prayer book, how you see anything is how you see everything. So there's something really connected to me between how I look at the billiard ball and how I look at someone suffering, or how I look at human beings around me. And writer's first vocation is to be human among humans. And as we sharpen our self-emptying attentiveness and sensitivity in writing, I do believe we can see others with greater clarity and empathy. This is why I'm always interested in teaching writing, because I have a lot of students who don't want to be poets. They don't necessarily want to publish a book. But I do think there's something about paying attention to that subject and writing about it that makes you a better human being. Maybe that's lofty, but it's something that has kept me teaching for 20 years. The word attention has roots in the Latin past participle stem of attendere, give heed to, or literally to stretch toward. And I love that. I love that physical shading of the word, to stretch toward, when we're thinking about attending to others, especially to people who suffer, to stretch toward out of our comfortable, siloed places. Philosopher Simone Weil, who was a favorite of mine, wrote often about this creative attention toward others in her essay on how our school studies, in particular, sharpen our perceptivity and empathy. I put this quote on your sheet because it's a meaningful one to me, and somewhat long. But she says, the capacity to give one's attention to a sufferer is a very rare and difficult thing. It is almost a miracle. It is a miracle. Nearly all those who think they have this capacity do not possess it. Warmth of heart, impulsiveness, and pity are not enough. The love of our neighbor in all its fullness simply means being able to say to him, what are you going through? Which I would probably argue is one of the fiction writer's main questions when they're writing characters. And to look at our neighbor with attention, the soul empties itself of all its own contents, that self-emptying again, in order to receive into itself the being it is looking at, just as he is in all his truth. Only he who is capable of attention can do this. So that's the first thing I wanted to say about writing, that there's something there about sharpening our skills of attention and our empathy. The second one is maybe a little stranger, but it's kind of become really important to me lately. And I call it a calling to acknowledge one's tributaries. And the definition, and it has a few different definitions, but the definition of tributary I'm using is for a stream that flows into a river, so waterways, or river that flows into a lake. And I've begun canoeing. Any canoeists or kayakers in the crowd today? river folk. I've started dating a canoeist, and so you get real quickly intimate with rivers. But canoeing rivers is a really interesting experience with someone who's done it for 30 years when you're new at it. Because for me, when I'm canoeing, I'm in the front, and we're tandem canoeing, so he's in the back. And what I see is the river in front of me, huge, carrying me, looking for the rapids, watching for the rocks. But his attention is kind of elsewhere. It's always kind of toward the bank. And I'm so struck with his sensitivity to the tributaries coming in, usually a tiny, tiny stream that you can only detect through a tiny little track in the silt on the bank and a slight change in temperature as you pass. And he's always saying, we're passing such and such a creek or such and such a stream. So I love, he'll say, see that spring coming in, and he notices these tiny streams. So tributaries can be hard to see, is why I bring up this metaphor. But of course, they are the whole reason the river exists. So as a metaphor for this sort of writing vocation sort of subject, writing attunes us to the tiny and major tributaries that flow into us but also out of us, our sources and our influences, as well as our audience and our community that connects with our work and may find something life-giving in our work. And like the many, many creeks and springs that feed into the river, our tributaries are multiple and various. And I think in some ways being a writer and cultivating that writing life keeps you ever with your eyes on where you come from and where you're going and who has made you who you are, what kind of voices you're in conversation with. Not necessarily like a crazy person with voices in your head, but sort of. And our tributaries are eclectic, sometimes gushing and obvious, and sometimes very secret, very easy to overlook or dismiss. The most original writer is paradoxically the one most in touch with our origins. And our origins, our tributaries, are sometimes given to us and sometimes sought out by us. Let me explain with a reference to an essay I really love by a Mississippi writer, Kiese Layman. I don't know if anyone has heard of Kiese. He wrote the memoir Heavy, which is quite beautiful, and several essays. And this one opens with a focus on his grandmother as one of the tributaries flowing into him in his writing. I'm just going to read the opening that I think is quite fascinating. I put the essay title in the bibliography, so you can look online. It was in the Oxford American a few years ago. He writes about his grandmother. From 6 in the morning until 5 in the afternoon, 5 days a week for 30 years, my grandmama Catherine's fingers, palms, and wrists wandered deep in the bellies of dead chickens. Grandmama was a buttonhole slicer at a chicken plant in central Mississippi. Her job was to slice the belly and pull out the guts of thousands of chickens a day. Grandmama got up every morning around 4:30 a.m. She took her bath, prepared grits, smoked sausage, and pear preserves for us. After breakfast, Grandmama made me take a teaspoon of cod liver oil for my vitamins. Then she coated the area between her breasts in powder before putting on the clothes she had ironed the night before. I was 10, staying with Grandmama for the summer. And I remember marveling at her preparations and wondering why she got so fresh, so clean, just to leave the house and get dirty. And then Layman goes on in this essay to talk about his grandma's pride in her work, how she wanted to be the best buttonhole slicer in the plant, not to please her racist and sexist white managers, but for herself, a Southern black woman, and Layman writes, for all the Southern black women workers coming next. And he writes, by the end of the day, when the two-tone blue Impala crept back into the driveway on the side of our shotgun house, I'd run out to welcome Grandmama home. Hey, baby, she'd say, let me wash this stank off my hands before I hug your neck. So she, at the very beginning of this essay, is a clear tributary for Layman. But what's interesting about what he writes in this essay is it took him a long time to fully acknowledge who she was in his life and continues to be. In this essay, he says, I didn't fully understand or feel inspired by Grandmama's stank or freshness until years later. And this is when he heard the albums of the Georgia-based hip-hop artist Outkast. Some people might be some Outkast fans in the room. So really, this essay kind of oscillates between talking about his grandma and talking about what this hip-hop duo from the South, and at the time, New York hip-hop was really, in his day, kind of all there was. But he kind of heard hip-hop coming from the South, and it was kind of a different sound. It did a different thing. And it ricochets in the essay back and forth, reverberates with his understanding about his grandma. So we get another tributary, in other words. So he was in college up in Oberlin, and he walked by somebody's room in his dorm and heard an Outcast line about cod liver oil. And of course, his grandma gave him cod liver oil every day. And so it rang true with his own childhood. And he heard in their song, Waylon, another song on the album, the sounds of Southern black folks he had grown up around Mississippi. And he appreciated the New York hip hop, but he said as a Southerner, he said he never felt himself loved and imagined by it, like he did in this work produced by this other band, Outkast. The essay continues to weave together a tribute, which I think is kind of a funny little pun there on our discussion of tributaries. Tribute is another kind of manifestation of that word. A tribute to both his tributaries, his grandmother and Outcasts, who gave him needed permission and vision as a Southern black artist and worker. And what's interesting to me about this is to think for a second, in what art have you felt yourself loved and imagined? In what art have you found yourself loved and imagined, as he did in this music? I know for me, I vividly remember reading Jane Ann Phillips when I was quite young, her book, Black Tickets, stories in which I recognized the complex landscape and culture of my West Virginia home, which can be kind of dismissed in some of the broader narratives of what Appalachia can be or should be. And also the novels of David James Duncan, so an Oregonian writer, very different context, but someone who was Seventh-day Adventist, and in his book, The Brothers K, he made church experience and the sibling conversations around what was going on in church. He made it the stuff of literature, which to me at that time sounded like lame subject matter. Like I didn't know that could be in literature. So those are people that kind of started me thinking about a validity of these subjects that mattered to me in life as valid as subject matter. But also my own mother whose creativity included quilting. She wasn't a writer, but she made sauerkraut, and she lived very creatively and still does. Also, the elderly man who played banjo by ear at my church. Later on, teachers, writers, filmmakers. So a lot of people I sought out and wanted to learn from. But I believe why I'm talking about this is I believe the more we see our tributaries as multiple from all walks of life, and the more we honor these manifold sources of others, we are able to better honor the manifold sources of others. In other words, we think less reductively of other human beings. If we understand ourselves as so multiple, we start seeing, well, this is everybody's experience, not just mine. And I think as a culture, we've become so isolated in our reductionism. We call someone liberal or conservative as if that word completely defines them. During the pandemic, we saw this really weird thing happen with wearing or not wearing a mask. And there was this weird symbolic complex that started sort of emerging there where you could say, you wear a mask or not wear a mask. I know who you voted for, what your salary is, whether you eat organic food, who you hate. I have no curiosity about you anymore. I don't wonder about you anymore. There's a sort of closing down of seeing other people as multiple. But when we give gratitude for our multiple tributaries and see how wildly and necessarily various they are, it can help us see everyone as complicated and multiple and shot through with a prism of stories and sources. So following this metaphor, the other direction is we also flow outward, as human beings, and we ask that related question, who might feel themselves loved and imagined in our work? It's a humbling question, and it sort of gives you a bit of a seriousness in your work of what might be possible, that someone might feel loved and imagined. Can I, as an artist, make something someone can inhabit and call home? I had a letter from someone with this last novel, and she used that word. She said, thanks for writing something in which I found a home. And that's all I needed as a writer. I felt like I'd reached a kind of joy that was unparalleled. Someone I didn't even know could find a home. So can I help others feel more alive and their lives more deeply lived? All that is sheafed up in them and somehow acknowledged by my work. That's kind of the goal, I think, when we think about how we flow out. And there's another essay about tributaries that I love by a Kentucky writer, Crystal Wilkinson. She's a good friend and really wonderful on all kinds of genres. And when Bell Hooks died, who was kind of a huge visionary of Appalachian feminism, and she died just last year in 2021. And in the Atlantic, they ran this article that said, "I am a writer because of Bell Hooks." That was Wilkinson's terrific article. And it's all about how Hooks, as a revolutionary intellectual and artist, helped Wilkinson and so many other Kentucky women writers find their voices and home as writers. And she writes, "Bell showed us that all things were possible for rebellious, bookish black girls. She reminded us that no matter the prevailing stereotypes of Kentuckians as white, illiterate, poor, no matter the unfinished business of eliminating, as she put it, the imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy." Hooks was fiery. Kentucky was also a culture of belonging. And Wilkinson talks about a circle of women inspired by and close to Hooks. And one is the wonderful poet Nikki Finney. If you haven't read Nikki Finney, go look her up. And she had my favorite lines in the essay. It was a conversation that she had with Wilkinson. She said, "I needed Bell Hooks in order to fully rise into all the women I hope to one day be. She was a raging, loving river of permission." I love that line. She was a raging, loving river of permission. So permission is kind of another way to think of this concept of tributaries. Who gave you permission? And this isn't just for writers. I think it's a question really for all of us. All of us feel like a kind of permission or validity is given. There's an exercise, but I'm not going to do it with you for sake of time. But think about it maybe on your own. It's on the sheet. This is from Maria Abagunde. She's a wonderful speaker, and she came to Hollins, and she gave this exercise of sort of writing to the person who gave you permission. You know, who was the first person who gave you permission to speak or breathe or sing or write or wrestle or play softball or study history or be a philosophy major? When we think back to the people who gave us that permission, sometimes it surprises us, you know, and has us writing letters to those people, and that's a really wonderful exercise. So I feel like the writing life has a lot to do with being really in touch with those sources that, and what's important, I think, especially coming from Appalachia, coming from a place that's stamped one thing. J.D. Vance has stamped us a certain kind of hillbilly elegy, kind of Appalachian, we're Trump country, you know, we're stamped one thing, sometimes by the broader thing. And it's really good to know I am so many things, as anybody is. And so it's good to kind of see that variousness and prismatic reality of who you are as a writer and who you are as a person. The last thing I want to talk about is a little bit strange, maybe. It sort of touches it on the online dating essay that Dr. Story was talking about earlier. It's an essay I wrote about. It's about online dating, but it's really about the nature of desire and how longing functions in our life. And so I kind of think of writing as a calling to contemplative longing. I borrow that phrase from C.E. Morgan. She's a wonderful writer, went to Berea, and she's writing about Marilynne Robinson's novel, Housekeeping, which is her first novel. Came out in 1980, so it's been around for a while. It has a kind of biblical resonance for me. And I'm just going to read this one passage from Robinson's novel. This is sort of what C.E. Morgan is talking about in this article, where she talks about the contemplative longing in this novel. It's quite beautiful. She writes, "For need can blossom into all the compensations it requires. To crave and to have are as like a thing in its shadow. For when does a berry break upon the tongue as sweetly as when one longs to taste it? And when is the taste refracted into so many hues and savors of ripeness and earth? And when do our senses know anything so utterly as when we lack it?" And here again is a foreshadowing. The world will be made whole. For to wish one for a hand on one's hair is all but to feel it. So whatever we may lose, very craving gives it back to us again. Though we dream and hardly know it, longing like an angel fosters us, smooths our hair, and brings us wild strawberries. I think if I could bring you one thing today in this lecture is simply that beautiful passage and the recommendation to read Housekeeping, the beautiful novel. But to wish for a hand on one's hair is all but to feel it. Whatever we may lose, very craving gives it back to us again. Longing fosters us. It has substance. It is not a problem to be solved, but it is itself maybe a form of solution. This is very counterculture in terms of thinking. We could talk about this passage for a very long time, but I want to focus specifically on what a description of longing might then mean for the writing life in particular. How the practice of contemplative longing is part of the writer's calling. Longing takes us to the liminal space, the in-between space, between not having and fulfillment. And from the Latin limina, meaning threshold, liminality is the space of not yet. And people who resonate with the Christian faith know this space with regard to time really well. We feel ourselves as eternal beings, but also we feel that itch of having to live within time, knowing resurrection as a living force in ourselves, even as we move closer each day to death. So we know the not yet at our vulnerable core. We know this pause and this waiting. And we might know it too in forms of prayer, depending on what kinds of prayer you're familiar with. There's apathetic prayer, which is a form of centering prayer that has silence. There's a lot of listening. It's a lot of quiet instead of speaking. And we might experience prayer in silence. Cynthia Bourgeault has this really beautiful book on this kind of prayer, on centering prayer, and she says, silence is not just a precondition for revelation. Silence is not a backdrop for form, and diffuse open awareness is not only an empty chalice waiting to be filled with specific insights and directives. It is its own kind of perceptivity. It is its own kind of communion. So longing, like this quality of silence that has a kind of palpable substance to it, is a thing, is itself a fertile thing, and not merely a preface for satisfaction. To cherish longing is disruptive, I would say, in our algorithmically based world, fixated on satisfying our every desire, tailoring our matches on dating apps, creating a playlist that anticipates our preferences so brilliantly. Contemporary life revolves around being satiated at all times. Even in our rhetoric around vocation, as I started talking about, we focus on satisfaction and fulfillment. But the writing life, it seems to me, is a vocation that befriends and respects longing and grief and loss, and the idea that the feltness of life in its manifold dimensions is surprising and strange, and not quite something we can grasp or even predict. Not something that an algorithm can anticipate and track for our customer satisfaction. The writer cultivates longing as the shiver and tremble and above, just outside of life, and thus deep within the core of life itself. The writer seeks out the threshold because it's a place of transformation, an uncomfortable one, but a place of transformation, transforming the everyday into beauty and art. So this transformation is what gives lift to our ordinary experience. I love this passage from a famous essay by Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky in his essay, Art as Technique. And it's a little bit of a complicated one, but I thought it was worth sharing on your sheet. This is also real easy to find online. And it's a dense essay, but it's really foundational, I think, if you're interested in writing that is awake and embraces strangeness, but also isn't interested in shock value or sensationalism. It's a very meaningful article, very old artist technique. But he says in this essay, habit devours everything: objects, clothes, furniture, your wife, and the fear of war. That which we call art exists in order to remedy our perception of life, to make things felt, to make the stone stony. The purpose of art is to evoke in man a sensation of things, to make him perceive things rather than merely recognize them. In order to do so, art uses two devices: making things strange and complicating the form, so as to increase the duration and difficulty of perception. So art might slake our thirst in some ways, but it also creates a new thirst. the kind of art that I'm talking about. This imaginative work defamiliarizes the world, makes it strange. You might have had an experience. Sometimes we hear a poem and somehow it makes us feel homesick for our own lives. Or when you love someone quite deeply, you miss them when they're in the room with you. It's a really kind of weird sensation that you probably recognize if you've known love. Maybe with a foretaste of their loss, maybe a foretaste of their death, which only deepens their belovedness somehow. So those kind of moments where we feel ourselves almost a stranger at the gates of our own lives, art resides there, I think. We strive in our writing for a sense of inevitability, a sense of course it must be that way, which is really surprise born naturally from the work, instead of predictability, something that we can predict and that we already feel we're kind of weary of. The deeper recognition is not that surface familiarity. The deeper recognition is the sensation, as Shklovsky says, of things as they are perceived in their dimension, not as they're known flatly and forgettably and dismissively. So this circles back around, I think, to attention. Maybe contemplative longing is the cleansing of the lens in some ways through which we can see and look. It's also a grounding, I think, in our deepest selves. And I love this poem from Liang Li. I could just quote a few lines, but it's easy to find online. It's his poem, I Loved You Before I Was Born. He says, in longing I am most myself, wrapped, my lamp mortal, my light hidden and singing. In longing we're in touch with that deep green pith that keeping us wrapped with attention can generate through us maybe beautiful things that may help with each small word and sound to recreate the world for someone else. So that's all I have today, and there's also, because I'm a believer in going further on your own, I've given you a bibliography of things that have meant a lot to me in terms of thinking through what is the writer's vocation all about, and I'd be happy to talk about any of them. So thank you for your attention this morning.